The telegram arrived on a Tuesday, a day already steeped in the dreary monotone of a London drizzle. Its stark yellow envelope felt unnervingly cold to the touch, a premonition perhaps of the chilling tidings within. Alistair Finch, a name that once graced bestseller lists with predictable regularity, now found himself staring at the curt, desperate lines penned by his estranged sister-in-law, or rather his eccentric Aunt Morwen, as young Leo had known her. His son, Leo, a bright spark of 10 years, had vanished. Vanished, the telegram stated, from within the very walls of Shadowfen Manor, Morwen's rambling, isolated pile in the bleakest part of the Northumberland moors. A faint, almost imperceptible thrumming seemed to vibrate from the cheap paper, a discordant note in the symphony of urban despair. Alistair had always harboured a certain unease regarding Morwen and her ancestral home. Shadowfen. The name itself was a whisper of decay, of things best left undisturbed. He recalled Leo's bubbling excitement at the prospect of visiting the old estate, filled with tales of hidden passages and sprawling, untamed gardens. Now that excitement was a cruel echo, drowned out by the stark pronouncement of his absence. The police, the telegram continued, were baffled. No trace, no sign of forced entry. It was as if the boy had simply dissolved into the ancient stonework, swallowed by the house itself. The rain outside intensified, beating a frantic rhythm against the window panes, a counterpoint to the sudden icy dread gripping Alistair's heart. He had not spoken to Morwen in years, not since the unpleasantness following his wife Eleanor's departure. The separation had been acrimonious, a slow, painful tearing of shared lives, and Morwen, ever loyal to her own blood, had made her disapproval chillingly clear. Yet the urgency in those few scrawled words was undeniable, a raw plea that transcended old grievances. Leo was missing. His son. The thought was a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. He had to go. There was no question, no alternative. The city, with its familiar comforts and distractions, suddenly felt like a gilded cage, while the distant, forbidding Shadowfen beckoned with a grim, irresistible pull. The journey north was a blur of grey skies and racing thoughts, each mile drawing him closer to a place he instinctively felt was steeped in sorrow. He remembered Eleanor's stories of Shadowfen, whispered in childhood, tales of strange occurrences, of an atmosphere that clung to one's spirit like cobwebs. She had always dismissed them as fanciful imaginings, the product of an overactive imagination fostered by isolation. But now, with Leo gone, those old tales took on a sinister new light. The train's rhythmic clatter seemed to mock him, each beat a step further into an unfolding nightmare, underscored by that persistent low hum he now realized was not external, but resonating deep within his own mind. Alistair Finch was a man acquainted with ghosts, though not, until now, the spectral kind. His were the phantoms of memory, of opportunities lost and words unsaid. His literary success, the accolades, the comfortable life it afforded, had always felt like a fragile veneer over a deeper, more persistent melancholy. This unspoken sorrow had its roots in a childhood incident, a moment of boyish recklessness that had ended in tragedy for a companion, a lad named Gideon. The guilt, though buried deep beneath the strata of years and achievements, had never truly faded. It was a cold, hard knot in the pit of his stomach, a silent companion to his every triumph, a subtle discord in the melody of his life. His marriage to Eleanor had been for a time a sanctuary. Her laughter, her pragmatism had been a balm to his often brooding nature, but even her light could not entirely dispel the shadows that clung to him. The birth of Leo had brought a new, fierce joy, a reason to strive for genuine contentment. Yet the unspoken grief, the weight of Gideon's memory, had remained a subtle poison, slowly, almost imperceptibly, eroding the foundations of their shared life. He had never spoken of Gideon to Eleanor, a silence that, in retrospect, had become a chasm between them. The strain, when it finally became visible, was like watching a beautiful porcelain vase develop a hairline crack, then another, until the entire structure was compromised. The separation, when it came, was not a sudden cataclysm, but the quiet, inevitable collapse of something long weakened from within. Eleanor had accused him of being distant, of living more in the shadowed corridors of his mind than in the sunlit reality of their family. He could not deny it. The success that the world saw was for him a constant reminder of a life he felt, in some profound way, he did not fully deserve. The creeping dread that had settled upon him in the months leading up to Leo's disappearance was not entirely new. It was an old acquaintance, a familiar chill that had simply found a fresh, more terrifying focus. And now, Leo. His bright, inquisitive son who deserved a father unburdened by such phantoms. The thought of his boy, lost and alone, perhaps frightened in a place like Shadowfen Manor, was an agony beyond words. It was as if all the unexpiated guilt from his past had coalesced, finding its ultimate cruel expression in this new crisis. The hum, that strange internal vibration, intensified with each passing thought of Gideon, a chilling resonance between the old sorrow and the present terror. He knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that this was not just a missing person case. This was something else. Something tied to the very fabric of his being. Aunt Morwen was a spectre herself when Alistair finally arrived at Shadowfen Manor. Gaunt, her eyes wide with a terror that seemed to have hollowed her from the inside out, she was a far cry from the stern, formidable woman he remembered. She clung to him, her fingers like talons, her voice a hoarse whisper that scraped against the oppressive silence of the vast cold hall. It took him. "Alistair!" she rasped, her gaze darting towards the shadowed corners of the room, as if expecting something to lunge forth. "The house, Shadowfen. It's always been hungry. It wanted a child. It took your Leo." Her words, stark and mad, sent a fresh icicle of dread down Alistair's spine. He tried to reason with her, to offer the mundane explanations of the local constabulary, a boy wandering off, an accident on the moors. But Morwen would not be swayed. She spoke of whispers in the walls, of cold spots that moved with an intelligent malevolence, of doors that opened and closed on their own accord, not with the creak of old hinges, but with a soft, deliberate sigh, as if the house itself were breathing. She described an ancient presence, a sentience within the stone and timber that had long lain dormant, only to be awakened by Leo's innocent vitality. It was the rambling of a grief-stricken mind, surely, yet her conviction was unnervingly absolute. 2 days later, Morwen was gone. She took her own life, leaving behind a single cryptic note. "It will not rest. It demands a sacrifice or a trade." The local doctor attributed it to the unbearable strain, the profound grief. But Alistair, standing alone in the echoing silence of Shadowfen, felt a different, more sinister truth begin to dawn. The air in the house was thick, oppressive. It seemed to press in on him, heavy with an unspoken history, a silent, watchful malevolence. The very stones seemed to exude a palpable cold, a dampness that had nothing to do with the incessant Northumberland rain. Against all sensible advice, against the frantic protestations of Eleanor over the crackling telephone line, Alistair decided to stay. It was not a decision born of logic, but of a grim, undeniable compulsion. He had to understand. He had to find Leo. If Morwen's mad pronouncements held even a sliver of truth, then leaving Shadowfen would be abandoning his son to whatever darkness lurked within its ancient heart. He moved into one of the less dilapidated guest rooms, the sparse furnishings offering little comfort against the encroaching dread. The house seemed to settle around him, a silent, patient predator, and the faint thrumming in his mind pulsed with a new, almost expectant rhythm. The first few nights at Shadowfen Manor were a descent into a waking nightmare. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and fraught, plagued by visions that were too vivid, too chillingly real to be mere dreams. He saw Leo, a fleeting, translucent figure at the end of a long, dark corridor, his small hand outstretched, his face etched with a silent plea. But whenever Alistair tried to reach him, the image would dissolve like mist, leaving only the suffocating silence and the oppressive weight of the manor's unseen presence. The house itself seemed to watch, its myriad unseen eyes fixed upon him, its ancient timbers groaning like a creature in discomfort. Worse than the visions of his lost son were the nightmares that dredged up the forgotten face from his distant past. Gideon, the boy he had known, the boy whose laughter had been silenced too soon. In these dreams, Gideon was no longer a child, but something older, colder, his eyes burning with an ancient accusatory light. He would whisper Alistair's name, the sound echoing from the depths of some unseen abyss, a summons and a condemnation. The details of that long-ago tragedy, details Alistair had suppressed for decades, returned with horrifying clarity, each one a fresh stab of guilt. During the long, dark hours of wakefulness, the sounds of the house became his tormentors. The wind, whistling through ill-fitting window frames, seemed to carry faint, mournful cries. Floorboards creaked in empty rooms above, the footsteps of an unseen occupant pacing relentlessly. And then there was the owl. Its call, a drawn-out, mournful hoot, seemed to emanate from just outside his window, unnervingly close, a feathered sentinel of the encroaching darkness. It was a sound that spoke of desolate moors and ancient sorrows, a fitting soundtrack to his growing despair. He began to wander the labyrinthine corridors of Shadowfen, driven by a desperate hope and a gnawing fear. Each room was a mausoleum of forgotten lives, filled with dust-sheeted furniture and the faint, cloying scent of decay. He would call Leo's name, his voice a thin, reedy sound, swallowed by the immensity of the house. Sometimes he thought he heard a reply, a faint giggle, a whispered word, but it was always just out of reach. A cruel trick of the acoustics, or perhaps something far more sinister. The thrumming in his head was now a constant companion, a low vibrational hum that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the manor. Relief, or at least a semblance of human contact, arrived in the unlikely form of Mr. Josiah Abernathy. He appeared at the kitchen door one blustery afternoon, a small, wiry man with spectacles perched precariously on his nose and an air of kindly academic curiosity. He introduced himself as the local historian, a lifelong resident of the nearby village, and a man with an abiding, if somewhat eccentric, interest in the lore surrounding Shadowfen Manor. He carried a worn leather satchel and a thermos of what smelled comfortingly like strong tea. His presence was a small beacon in the overwhelming gloom. Mr. Abernathy was a fount of local history, his conversation peppered with tales of ancient trackways, forgotten chapels, and the peculiar energies said to converge upon the very land where Shadowfen stood. He spoke of ley lines, invisible conduits of terrestrial power, and hinted that the manor had been built upon a thin place, a point where the veil between worlds was unusually permeable. He did not dismiss Morwen's claims out of hand, but listened with a grave attentiveness that Alistair found strangely reassuring. The old historian seemed to understand that some truths lay beyond the purview of police reports and rational explanations. As Abernathy spoke of the manor's long and often tragic history, of previous inhabitants who had suffered inexplicable misfortunes, of strange disappearances that predated Leo's by centuries, a faint, almost inaudible sound seemed to drift from the overgrown gardens beyond the kitchen window. It was a rhythmic, almost musical hum, like distant wordless chanting. Alistair glanced out, but saw only the wind-tossed branches of ancient yews. Abernathy, however, merely nodded, as if this were an expected phenomenon. "The old songs," he murmured. "They linger in the air here if one has the ears to hear them." Over several days and many cups of Abernathy's fortifying tea, a strange sort of alliance formed between the grieving author and the eccentric scholar. Abernathy lent Alistair books, obscure local histories filled with cryptic passages and unsettling folklore. He spoke of protective wards, of rituals designed to appease or banish restless spirits. He never overtly stated a belief in the supernatural, but his discourse was so steeped in its possibilities that it offered a framework, however unsettling, for understanding the madness unfolding around Alistair. For the first time since Leo's disappearance, Alistair felt he was not entirely alone in his terrifying conviction that Shadowfen held his son. The paranormal activity within Shadowfen Manor began to escalate, moving from unsettling whispers to overtly hostile manifestations. It was no longer a matter of creaking floorboards or a pervasive chill. The house itself seemed to be actively rebelling against Alistair's presence, or perhaps toying with him. Objects would not merely be misplaced, but would reappear in impossible locations. His worn copy of Shakespeare, left on the nightstand, was found open in the damp, crumbling chapel at the far end of the estate, its pages riffled as if by an unseen, angry hand. The faint metallic scent of old iron mixed with something disturbingly organic, like freshly turned earth or dried blood, began to cling to the air in certain corridors. Doors, which Alistair was certain he had locked, would be found ajar, sometimes swinging gently as if someone had just passed through. Other times they would slam shut with a violent bang that reverberated through the ancient structure, the sound like a drawn-out, exasperated sigh from the very depths of the manor's being. Cold spots no longer drifted aimlessly, but seemed to follow him, pockets of icy air that would envelop him suddenly, raising gooseflesh on his arms and making the fine hairs on his neck stand on end. He took to wearing his heaviest coat indoors, a futile defence against a chill that emanated from no earthly source. One evening, as a relentless, typically Northumbrian downpour lashed against the windows, isolating Shadowfen further from the outside world, Alistair sat in the gloomy library, poring over one of Abernathy's arcane texts. Suddenly, the heavy oak table before him shuddered violently. Books tumbled from the shelves and a portrait of a stern-faced ancestor crashed to the floor, the glass shattering with a startling finality. For a heart-stopping moment, the room seemed to tilt, the very foundations of the house groaning in protest. The thrumming in his head intensified to a painful, disorienting buzz, and he had the distinct, horrifying sensation of unseen hands pressing down on his shoulders. He began to document the events meticulously, a writer's habit in the face of the inexplicable. His notes, however, read less like a sober account and more like the fragmented ravings of a mind teetering on the brink. He wrote of shadows that seemed to detach themselves from the walls, coalescing into vaguely humanoid shapes in the periphery of his vision, only to dissipate when he turned to confront them. He tried to maintain a facade of rationality, but the mounting evidence was undeniable. Shadowfen Manor was not merely haunted, it was a place of active, intelligent malevolence, and its focus, he feared, was inexorably narrowing upon him. With Mr. Abernathy's guidance, Alistair began to piece together the fragmented history of Shadowfen and its environs. The local folklore, the cryptic entries in old parish records, and Abernathy's own unsettling theories started to form a coherent, if terrifying, tapestry. It became increasingly clear that the manor was more than just an old house. It was a conduit, a focal point for energies that were ancient and profoundly unnatural. The thin place Abernathy had spoken of was not merely a quaint local superstition, but a chilling reality, and something had torn that veil wider. The key, Alistair began to suspect, lay not just with the house, but with him. The recurring nightmares of Gideon intensified, no longer confined to sleep. Flashes of the boy's face, twisted in an expression of sorrow and accusation, would superimpose themselves over his waking vision. And then, the sound. The faint, distorted giggling of a child, cruel and knowing, began to echo from the deeper recesses of the house. From the locked cellars, from the boarded-up attic, from rooms Alistair had not yet dared to explore. It was a sound that chilled him to the bone, for it was unmistakably Gideon's laughter, warped and made monstrous by whatever realm now held him. Abernathy, after much hesitant deliberation, shared a particularly disturbing piece of local legend. Generations ago, a child connected to the Thorn family, Morwen's ancestors, the original builders of Shadowfen, had vanished in circumstances mirroring Leo's. The child, it was whispered, had been taken by an entity tied to the land, an entity that sought to redress an ancient wrong, or perhaps simply fed on sorrow and innocence. And then, the crucial connection. Abernathy, through painstaking research into Alistair's own lineage, uncovered a forgotten link. Alistair's ancestors, generations back, had a bitter feud with the Thorns over this very land, and Gideon, Alistair's lost childhood friend, had been a distant descendant of that slighted Thorn branch. The horrifying truth slammed into Alistair with the force of a physical blow. Shadowfen Manor wasn't just a haunted house, it was a stage for a vengeance that had simmered for generations. Gideon, his childhood guilt made manifest, had become the vengeful spirit, his spectral form empowered by the Manor's dark energies. He had not sought just any child, he had sought Alistair's child. Leo was a pawn in a ghostly game of retribution, dragged into a spectral dimension, a shadowy echo of Shadowfen, tethered to the Manor by Gideon's undying rage and Alistair's unexpiated sin. The house had merely provided the gateway. The knowledge that Gideon, the boy whose memory had haunted his waking life, was the architect of Leo's torment was a devastating revelation. Yet it also brought a perverse kind of clarity. The enemy had a name, a face, a history intertwined with his own. Mr. Abernathy, his usual scholarly composure tinged with a grave solemnity, explained that confronting Gideon would require more than just courage. It would necessitate a journey into the spirit's own domain, the spectral echo of Shadowfen that existed just beyond the veil. He spoke of an arcane ritual, a dangerous and uncertain path that could temporarily open a doorway. The ritual itself was performed in the oldest part of the manor, the crumbling foundations beneath the main cellars, a place where the air was heavy and the stones seemed to weep a perpetual icy dampness. Abernathy chanted in a low, resonant voice, words in a language Alistair did not recognize, but which vibrated deep within his bones. Chalk symbols glowed faintly on the flagstones. The thrumming in Alistair's head escalated to a deafening roar, and the very fabric of reality around him seemed to shimmer and distort. Before him, the solid wall of the cellar appeared to dissolve into a swirling vortex of shadow and sickly green light. This was the threshold. Stepping through was like plunging into icy water, a shock that stole his breath and senses. He found himself in a grotesque parody of Shadowfen Manor. The corridors were twisted, the rooms filled with grasping shadows and whispering voices that echoed his deepest fears and regrets. The air was thick with the scent of decay and despair. This was Gideon's kingdom, built from sorrow and sustained by vengeance. Alistair called out Leo's name, his voice swallowed by the oppressive, unnatural silence of this netherworld. The very ground beneath his feet seemed to pulse with a malevolent, unseen energy, trying to pull him down into its depths. He found Leo in what should have been the nursery, a room now warped into a cage of thorny vines and shifting darkness. Gideon stood before him, no longer the translucent spectre of Alistair's nightmares, but a being of palpable rage. His form flickering like a faulty gas lamp, his eyes burning with an ancient, unappeasable grief. The confrontation was not one of physical strength, but a battle of wills, a desperate plea for forgiveness against a torrent of spectral fury. Alistair spoke of his guilt, his remorse, laying bare the decades of hidden pain. He offered himself in Leo's place, anything to appease the tormented spirit of the boy he had wronged so long ago. The spectral realm shuddered around them as Alistair poured out his confession, his raw remorse a force almost as tangible as Gideon's rage. For a moment, the burning hatred in Gideon's eyes flickered, replaced by an echo of the lost, confused boy he once was. It was enough. With a final anguished cry that seemed to tear through the fabric of both worlds, Gideon's form began to dissipate, not in vanquishment, but as if he were being reluctantly drawn away, his energy unravelling. Alistair seized Leo's hand, pulling his son away from the dissolving nightmare, back towards the faint glimmer of the portal Abernathy had opened. They stumbled back into the cellar of Shadowfen, Leo blinking in the dim light, dazed but blessedly whole. The relief was so profound it brought Alistair to his knees. Mr. Abernathy, pale but resolute, helped them up, his eyes filled with a weary understanding. The immediate crisis was over. Leo was safe. Yet, as Alistair looked at his son, a new, chilling sensation prickled at the edges of his awareness. A coldness that had not been there before, a subtle, lingering shadow within his own mind, a whisper of Gideon's unending sorrow. The escape had not been entirely clean. The reunion with Eleanor when she arrived frantic and disbelieving was a tapestry of tears, recriminations, and ultimately a fragile, nascent understanding. The shared trauma of Leo's ordeal, the brush with an inexplicable darkness, forged a new, tentative bond between them. The explanations were difficult, bordering on the impossible, but the sight of Leo, safe and sound, was a truth that superseded all others. They left Shadowfen Manor that very day. The brooding edifice receding in the rearview mirror, still ominous, its hunger perhaps sated for now, but its ancient power undiminished, waiting. Alistair Finch returned to a life irrevocably altered. He had faced his past, saved his son, and in doing so had found a measure of peace. Yet it was a bittersweet triumph, for he knew that a fragment of Gideon Thorne, a sliver of his spectral rage and sorrow, had latched onto him, a permanent, chilling companion, a psychic scar. He would carry this shadow always, a constant reminder of the price of redemption and the darkness that can lie dormant, not just in ancient manors, but within the hidden chambers of the human heart. The thrumming was still there, fainter now, but a permanent echo of Shadowfen's lament.